can sum up the Green Bank of New York is they enable innovation. They allow people to innovate and create access to capital as a result, and it spurs activity and it creates people the excitement to innovate. And so they're a major player. But as we talk about innovation and we talk about the free flow of data, we also recognize now we live in a world in which the free flow of data has its vulnerabilities. And so I've asked Al Berkeley to come up and speak about that. As I mentioned briefly, Al has quite a history, and I won't go through his entire deal. If we sent you in the invitation a link to his bio, I suggest you look at it. He is a wealth of information and a great national asset for what he contributes to our country. And Al, I'm going to ask you to speak about our cyber and an update that he did at Impact event for us, I would say 3 years ago, the balance of data interoperability, IoT, and cyber.
Thank you. I'd like you to tell my wife the nice things you said about me. We're going to take just a minute here. I want to introduce a couple of people. Fred Fetterspiel is my business partner in several businesses. Key Han is an inventor who has cracked the code on one of the most disruptive technologies I've ever seen in renewable energy. He's still teeny, he's still in the lab, but it's going to really change the game over time. And Hugh Fitzpatrick, my partner at Princeton Capital Management, is a great investor, and we have a growth stock-oriented fund we run together. So Dixon asked me to talk a little bit about cyber, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background. I was sitting in my office. I used to work for the NASDAQ stock market, and I was sitting in my office, and my secretary came in and said, "It's Richard Clark at the White House." You may remember Richard Clark was the first cyber czar, and I actually didn't know him. I'd heard of him, but didn't really know him at all. And he said, "I understand NASDAQ has a really good cybersecurity program." This is about 1999. And I said, "Well, you know, we have this secret." He said, "We're a 5-day-a-week business. We can pull the system down on Saturday and Sunday and scrub it." Nobody ever thinks about that in the markets, but it's really quite an advantage as opposed to, say, a credit card processor who's got to be going 24 hours a day, every day of the year. At any rate, he said to me, he said, "I need," and he said it much more diplomatically than this, he said, "I need to wake the Clinton administration up to the cyber threat. Would you help me create a FACA committee, a Federal Advisory Committee Act committee?" Everything's regulated, you know. There are about 1,200 advisory committees under this law of people who are deserving of a place at the table when we're talking about cybersecurity. And I said, "Well, I'd be glad to do that. I know a lot of them." And so I called Craig Barrett at Intel and John Chambers at Cisco and the usual suspects. And we put together a group called the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. We did not get any attention from the Clinton administration because President Clinton was going through an impeachment process, and he didn't seem to think my cyber concerns were very important. However, when the Bush administration came in, we thought we'd be disbanded because nothing was going on. And then 9/11 happened, and we were stood up again very, very quickly and chartered to figure out what we needed to figure out. A very interesting set of instructions from the White House. Figure out what we need to figure out about security on the internet. We started with called Vince Cerf came in, who you will recognize as one of the originators of the TCP/IP world, and began with domain name servers and the security of domain name servers, etc. Well, in the course of the next 11 years, when I was involved with the NIAC, I was a member and then a permanent vice chair and then acting chair. I became very disillusioned about what was possible with network security. I realized from the simplest perspective that my mother, whom I'd given a reasonably smart phone to for the time, was never going to be able to make upgrades in it. Never had any interest in making upgrades in it. Neither did anybody else I knew. Maybe a few technical people were interested in patching their phone. And I used that as an example which resonated with the president, I think, in the reports we sent. that network security is practically impossible. There are too many endpoints. There are literally billions of endpoints where you can get in the system around the world. And I began to look for a different approach, and we thought that the right way to do it was to protect the data. But the chips weren't quite big enough. The microprocessors weren't quite strong enough in the early days to do two things at once. Specifically, let's say, process the credit card and encrypt and de-encrypt on the fly. And the only people who could really afford to encrypt their information in transit was the government. This is data moving. And they had special computers that de-encrypted and encrypted at each end, and they had to have secure rooms and separate air-gapped equipment. Well, as the chips got bigger, we realized we could intercept that, like a ballistic arc, you could intercept that chip improvement. Thank you very much. We realized we could intercept the growth and the power of chips and find the sweet spot where you could encrypt and de-encrypt on the fly. At the same time, you were processing the credit card or the medical record or the stock trade or whatever else it was you wanted the computer to do. And that began a beginning in 2005 or 6 around hardening the data instead of hardening the network. Assume that the bad guy is going to get through on the network. Then what do you do? And this began to be implemented in software. You began Unisys Corporation. Remember old Unisys Corporation? It's still out there. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. IBM and others began implementing systems that would harden the data by an approach that would take an encrypted piece of text and randomly select a bit, that's half a byte if you're technical, and put it in a bucket somewhere. You tell me how many buckets you want, and I'll set the system up to create that many buckets. There's no whole document anywhere. It drives the mathematics of de-encrypting through what's called brute force, through the roof. And it makes it very hard to break that code, particularly if you change those keys in a faster cycle than the de-encryption can happen. But it's a very interesting approach. Larry and I have talked about this before. So the point I'm making to you is that we are on the cusp of beginning to figure out the cyber issue. And Don McQuaid and I were talking at lunch today about a very interesting sideline of legacy businesses that happen to employ hundreds of thousands of people and have millions and millions of dollars of cash flow, and say, could you redirect some of your cash flow into these sustainable development goals? It gives you much more dollars to work with than the cash flows available from little, small, perfectly pristine companies. So from the point of view of the traditional progressive movement, you're dealing with sinners. You're dealing with people who would be automatically excluded from an environmental, social, and governance portfolio because they've got these legacy businesses that are big polluters or have some record of pollution or some other sin. And even though they are reformed sinners, there's no way for them to get praised and get attention and get encouraged to put more money in it. So we're in the business of building portfolios from among the largest 500 companies in the world. The first screen is, are they one of the largest 500 companies in the world by sales? If they are, have they committed in any of their regulatory filings to implement one or more of the sustainable development goals? So they don't have to call it a sustainable development. They've got a lot of gender equality stuff, which is big in the United States right now. We'll take them at their word that they're doing the right thing in that area, which is of interest to the SDGs. Then we put them through, if they've got this commitment, we put them through the screen of, are they really implementing something? Does it matter? They say they're directing money to it, but are they really doing it? And there's a number of consultancies out there that we work with to try to be sure we don't get fooled. And then we provide after that normal investment screens to say, yeah, this could be a good investment. We've been running this portfolio we back tested it all the way to 2000, but we've been really tracking it for 3 years. And we've had it invested most of this year, 2019. And we're getting near market returns or slightly better than market returns. And that's what you're dealing with is a very interesting investment question, because the academics will tell you that if you restrict the choice that an investor has, you automatically give up return. And we've restricted the choice to 500 companies, of which we actually invested about 169, a little more than you would invest in if you weren't working on this particular mandate. But are you giving up return in order to get a social good? And we think that you're not giving up return, you can get at least a market return, if not better than a market return. Well, the point I'm trying to make, and the way this gets back to XBRL and the standards that Dixon and the solar industry worked on, is standardizing, in the case of the solar industry, the production metrics and the consumption metrics for solar, is that as we go down the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 10 targets under each one, there are almost no standards in the world as to what you're measuring. And they vary as much as the metric system and the imperial system vary. There's no standardization, there's no standardized way to talk about success. So we're very interested in encouraging, and remember we've got a deadline in 2030 that we're working against 10 more years from now, to try to get standards in place not only for solar energy production and consumption, but also for a number of these other major sustainable development goals. So I hope, Dixon, I've covered the topics you want. I'll be glad to take questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, I'll let you go. Thank you.
Are you kind of developing monthly operating reports or monthly kind of?
Yeah, we do run we use Morningstar software
Oh, okay.
to produce a monthly report. And we do change the holdings if we think the investment merits have changed. And then each year you're getting a few more companies that are actually filing in their regulatory returns to their governments that they're committed to one or more. And so the number of companies that we have invested is going up slightly.
Is there an incentive for that? Is there an incentive for that?
Well, I
to
think
entice more and more to become part of this
I think
universal language you're
I
creating?
think the media is crucifying, and investors, and institutional investors particularly, are asking harder and harder questions of companies about their, whatever that organization's favorite issue is, whether it's clean water, gender equality, whatever their 17 areas.
And how do you encourage that?
How do we encourage it? Well, what we're trying to do with the largest companies is to draw attention to the fact they're doing something good. So much of the media is negative that companies, particularly large companies, pay attention when somebody says something good about them. And it's a two-sided market in the sense that we want the companies to put more of their cash flow into the SDGs, and we want the investors, institutional investors, to feel like they're getting something useful done with their commitment to SDG investing. We draw sharp distinctions between investing to get the Sustainable Development Goals accomplished from the normal environmental, social, and governance community, which is essentially risk averse and says no to a company that's doing something that isn't quite good. Where we're going out to centers, reform centers, and saying, we really appreciate the fact that you're doing something that you've not done in the past that's moving the ball in the right direction. And we understand that you've got these legacy businesses that are continuing to pollute. We're not going to criticize you about that. We're going to praise you for what you're trying to get done.
And so that creates awareness, which is what everybody needs. That
Everybody
creates
wants to be aware.
awareness.
Yeah.
That's the basic
Yeah.
tenet of good communication.
Yeah.
Thank you for what you do. And so you talked about some of the failings of the millennial goals, that it was member states or nations that signed on as opposed to cities and so forth. With respect to the 17 sustainability, the goals you're talking about, the more recent ones, that you're trying to develop standards to measure them and so forth, at the UN, who are the signatories associated with those?
Well, all of my contacts have come through Michael Moeller, he's just retired as the Chief Operating Officer of Geneva. And he was really the organizing force behind getting the Sustainable Development Goals put in. Everybody was willing to wash their hands of goals after the Millennial Development Goals failed. And he said, no, we can't give up on that. This is too important. Even though we got it wrong, we need to try again. And so all of my contacts, and I'm saying it this way because it is one of the largest bureaucracies you can imagine. There are something like 17 different parts of the UN that are involved in clean water. And so you've got these hardworking, smart, wonderful people, each trying to do their own thing in a way that creates a cacophony of conflict. Yes, Edward.
You talked about the 500 large companies that you've done, and then you've done a subset for the folks that are doing this. Are you going to create an index at some point for that, or?
We're trying to. That's an interesting question. That's what we were originally asked to do, was to create a NASDAQ 100-like index. And I said, well, why don't you just go to NASDAQ? When I was there, John Jacobs set up an index creation engine. And NASDAQ has about 1,100 indices around the world, Norwegian biotech, Swedish biotech, Danish biotech, American biotech, all these structures around the world. And actually what Roland Schatz told me is that they had been to NASDAQ, they had already talked to all the index manufacturers, and what happened is that every one of them wanted to subordinate the United Nations brand to their own brand. So it might be MSCI's SDG index, and they wanted to enhance their own brand. And I think you need to look at this whole effort as a way of the United Nations trying to do something that's really good and really powerful and really important in a way that enhances their brand. They are increasingly smart about the issue of brand awareness and the effectiveness of brand. And they had a tough time there because you remember we had all these UN peacekeeping troops raping people in Africa. I don't know if you remember that period of time, but it was a very tough time for the UN and its brand. And they're smart to try to do something about it. Yes.
Do you find any conflict? You mentioned that going to large corporations was a way to enable the goals that you had set forth. Do you find any conflict between enabling these corporations and governments that may not want to see them succeed?
Governments that may not want to see
corporations take some of their power.
Yeah, I've never actually expressed it that way, but I do think more of the problem we have is the who are you and what are you trying to do. It's not a policy debate, it's not a brand debate. It's really, well, why should we've got our own program to be good corporate citizens. We have just hired a person to run our environmental, social, and governance communications group. Who are you and why are you here? And that's a tough one. And we're just chipping at it because our mandate is to go deal in areas where the free enterprise community is not dealing. And there's a lot going on. I'll give you an example. And you may have seen this in the newspapers in the last year. Apparently, before the Industrial Revolution, there were about 4 billion trees in the world. Now there are about 3 billion trees in the world. And one of the things that UNGSI has been articulating, and other people have articulated and are picking up on, is let's plant 1 billion trees. Well, it's a pretty darn interesting concept, particularly if you break it down into chunks of 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever, and you go out and plant trees. You've got to have a 50-year horizon. You've got to find money up front, and how do you get a return on that? Unless you're a Weyerhaeuser or somebody in the tree business, you don't even think in those terms. So it's a really interesting set of issues. More topical is one we've been working on recently, which is some of these mega cities have just the worst air in the world. You read about it in China, you read about it in India. Mexico City, have you ever been to Mexico City? You don't want to breathe. You've been to Istanbul, you don't want to breathe. It's all diesel byproduct. So we're trying to find funding for 6,000 electric buses for Istanbul and maybe next in Mexico City. That's a really interesting project. We've been talking to people who've made some electric buses. We've talked to people who talk about the labor union and government involvement around the world and how it's a payola kind of model, and you've got the corruption is a major issue in many of these markets. But it's worth spending time on, because the impact on the air in Istanbul or Mexico City or Delhi or any of these other mega cities that are so polluted is costing people years off their life. So I'm not, the answer to your question is I haven't really experienced it in that regard, but there are other cynicisms, there are other conflicts that come up immediately.
I've got an anecdote to respond and also a question that are both of which are completely unrelated. First of all, your commentary about Richard Clark and his role in the Clinton administration trying to draw attention to cybersecurity risk and actually just in general to the risk of terrorism. I was in the Clinton administration at the time. I remember being called into White House Situation Room meetings with Dick Clark, and people thought he was a gadfly, and nobody would listen to him. It wasn't really until 9/11,
Right.
post-Clinton administration, the Bush administration, where suddenly his
He was
perceived
right,
as
he'd been right
crime
all
wolf
along.
suddenly became very, very real, and then he began appearing on ABC as a consultant on national security. So yes, congratulations for moving the ball forward under the Bush administration initiative to address weaknesses on national security. The question I really have is centering on the United Nations, and I am fully sympathetic with your observation that it is an enormous bureaucracy that has too many arms where the left hands don't know what the right hands are doing, and it's awfully difficult to try to manage things such as development of standards. On the other hand, the United Nations is famous for creating standards that it requires its members to abide by, such as the standards for meeting their targets for greenhouse gas reductions. Specifically, if you recall, under the Kyoto Protocol and the subsequent conferences of the parties that came out of the UN, they had the clean development mechanism. Again, this gets really kind of wonky and granular, and presumably they had the same issues of tracking compliance, validation, and verification. So one would have thought that they would have learned from that experience to be able to carry forward compliance with those 17 initiatives that you outlined.
Yeah.
Why weren't they able to learn from that experience?
Well, I think they have learned from, it's the issues, the 17 issues are so broad, and the 10 targets under each of the 17, you're really dealing with 169 targets. And I think that some of them are much more easy to measure than others. And part of that's because some of them are amenable to being measured by physics,
Right.
and some of them are amenable to being measured by compassion.
Social goals.
They are really
Yeah,
hard.
you can't
really hard.
quantify them through hard
Yeah,
data.
and I'll give you a specific example. I was talking to a man in Frankfurt, Germany, about one of the companies we were considering using in our portfolio. And he said, oh no, you can't use them. And I said, why not? And he said, because they don't have a labor union on their board of directors. And this is he was hard over on that. That was really important to him. And I realized right then I'd walked into a cultural swinging door. And so, at NASDAQ, we just said, what's the market cap? NASDAQ 100 are the largest 100 market cap companies at the time we put it together. That's pretty easy versus, are you really showing gender equality? Are you really showing, what are you doing for climate change, et cetera? So I don't shy away from the harder problems because I'm convinced that these are problems we've got to solve. You just look at what's happening with, we talked about glaciers, Don McQuaid and I were talking about glaciers, and his family's partially from Switzerland, and some of the glaciers outside their back door have melted. I took my wife, I won a raffle, took my wife on a cruise from Anchorage to Vancouver, and we nosed into the glaciers, as I'm sure some of you have done on these cruises, And I remember from my Air Force days seeing these miles of glaciers that were just gone. So it's very poignant and very real. And I'm delighted, all you have in life is your time, and I'm delighted to work a little bit on some of these hard problems.
Just a thought is that a lot of companies have their intrinsic capabilities and their extrinsic capabilities. And a lot of my research in the past has looked at, let's say, oil and gas. And before British Petroleum messed up, they seem to be doing a lot based on their core competencies and how they're progressing forward, calling themselves an energy company, investing in renewables, things like that. And then Alliant Energy, which is quite different. Do you look at companies and how they approach these goals based off of, or evaluate them based on their core competencies?
Well, you know, it's interesting because the struggle we have, and this is true of equity investing. Equity investing is the most labor-intensive intellectual game that you can imagine. Because it wasn't like, the way I built my career was, I was an institutional investor, first team All-American analyst on software. And the way I got ahead of the world is I just narrowed my aperture to software. Took Microsoft public, took Oracle public, all of the timing was perfect. I got smarter and better and got promoted because I closed the aperture down to fewer and fewer things. The way we've been given this portfolio by UNGSI, we've got companies in every industry you can name. They're there because they're big. And I'm mind-boggled by the task of trying to figure out what some of them are actually doing. That's why we use these consultants. There are 4 major consulting firms that are looking at the ESG compliance issues, and then there are these specialty consulting firms, one in Switzerland, for example, of a group of women who are doing nothing but measuring gender equality in major companies around the world, and they've got a whole 150, 200 set of questions that they're asking, and they're getting some really interesting insights. So I'm struggling to get the kind of detailed knowledge on these broad group of companies, but you can get enough to make a sensible judgment, I think. And remember, what we're trying to do is encourage them to put more money into the good things. So, does that make sense? Thank you very much.
So in closing, Al started his talk as I asked him to, that he's got his eye and his pulse on the cyber. And then he went into enabling innovation. Because innovation is really what the people around this table are talking about, and tomorrow's summit is about innovation and people are driving innovation. So I really appreciate you taking your time to join us tonight, and hopefully you were inspired by some of the innovation you heard, some of the people that are doing it. I will be happy to send the invitation to the gentlemen who joined us late, but in the attachments that went out, we gave everybody's name and email address so that you can follow up with the people you met, and we hope that you all had a good, enjoyable evening, and we really appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.